and welcome to episode 123. And for this episode, we are covering part two of translation and global marketing strategies for effective international campaigns. That just can't cover it in one episode, can we, Patrick? There's too much to talk
too
about.
much fun.
Too much fun to talk about. Well, why don't we jump right in? So the first one we wanted to cover was addressing idioms and colloquialisms in translation. We've talked about this numerous times, I think, anecdotally. That's easy. That's easy for me to say. No, it's not at all. It's Monday and my brain's blurry. But we've talked about that in different forms for a lot of different shows that we've done over the years. But why don't you get us started, Patrick? Anything to share on that topic?
Yeah, I think it's important. I mean, specifically in marketing or campaigns, but also anytime you're doing translation, I think having a plan in place for what you're going to do, if there's any idioms or colloquialisms in your source text, I think you can also prevent that by writing those out of your source text if that's how you want to play it. That kind of takes away that problem for you. But since we're talking about creative and marketing campaigns, I think, again, establishing a strategy for what you're going to do there, you could go word for word. You could say, hey, find an equivalent expression that fits this culture, this market, this region. But just determining what you're going to do and then sticking to that as you do roll out that campaign in other markets.
Yeah, there's a bunch of stuff to consider here. I mean, let's not even cover the most trite things. Everybody wants to talk about the taglines that don't work. Or the name of the Chevy Nova, or those things. We won't cover those. Those have been beaten to death. But I think the things that I would consider or bring up are, there's companies will use an acronym that spells out certain things, like it's the STEP program, and like the S stands for something, the T, the E, the P. Be careful. There's a way to address those. You can still call it the STEP program, but then spell it out differently. Or some people will try to, come up with an equivalent word that sort of lines up, and it's tough to do that. Like that's one potential problem with that. But then there's also the subtleties, right? Like I think of the one example that I know I brought up in an episode, but it's probably been a minute, is the subtle stuff, like when you have a header to a brochure and you say something like the art of cardiology. I think, as you may remember this example, Patrick, but when I was a project manager at a medical device manufacturer, we had this campaign, and we basically had, what came out of marketing is the idea that we had these beautifully printed reports that came out about the waveform. So they decided, hey, let's talk about the art of cardiology. And the problem with that is they, were then referring to the cardiologist as an artist. And I absolutely knew that my contemporaries in Italy were going to do backflips and see right over that, because in the European culture, doctors, especially cardiologists or specialists, are sort of demigods, where artists are not demigods, right? So in their idea. So they knew they were going to alienate a lot of physicians if we had stuck with the tone of that, with that campaign. So it had to be adjusted. They stuck with the art of cardiology, but nowhere did they ever refer to the cardiologist as an artist. It had to be changed. It just had to be changed.
Yeah, and I think what you can do to kind of get over that is to even just send your source text or your campaign or whatever it might be to someone from kind of, I'll call it, outside of the bubble of whoever came up with the concept or the campaign, and say, hey, what can go wrong here? Tell us the things we need to look out for. I think if you spend a little time on that up front, you can kind of shape the concept or campaign in a way that you won't run into those roadblocks down the line.
Absolutely. Great suggestion. All right. So the next topic is SEO considerations for multilingual websites. So kind of a big topic, but maybe if we can hit some of the highlights. Patrick, I know you've actually been on both sides of the equation, managing projects here and then actually creating content for clients.
Yes. I actually recently did a UK version of an English website for a client, so this is very, very fresh in my mind. Keyword research didn't really come into play because it was English US to English UK, so keywords were basically the same. But that would be important if you are going into a different market, making sure that you're showing up in search for the terms that you want to, both in your source language and then in your target languages too. And then getting into kind of the nitty gritty code stuff of making sure you're tagging those language pages correctly so that Google doesn't view those as duplicates and say, I'm going to ignore it because it's the same page. You want to use the correct tagging structure to make sure and say, hey, Google, actually, this page is in a different language. It's a different page completely. So make sure you index it appropriately. And then obviously, again, kind of nitty gritty background website stuff that you may not necessarily see when you look at the page, but making sure you have meta descriptions, title tags, H1s, all the fun stuff in the background and in the code to, again, make sure everything is showing up correctly when Google is indexing and crawling your site.
Yeah, and in terms of the translation, most tools should pick up the meta information and the information that's behind the scenes, whether it's on images or whether it's on in meta information on the page. Most tools should pick it up. You'll definitely want to test that to make sure. But then in terms of the translation, you also want to make sure that the agency that's handling the translation can identify which of the items are keywords, because there is a little bit different strategy to translating them. People do want to make it rocket surgery. It's definitely not rocket surgery, as they say. But what it is just requires a disciplined approach. And one of the easiest things that a translator can do to create more effective translation is to just simply go to their version of Google and do targeted searches on the keywords and see what hits. They may not necessarily agree with the translation, but if you're looking at two potential terms, hey, which one gets more hits? Which one is more popular? And using and utilizing that translation is really the way to go. So it does take a little more effort because you're doing some additional research on each term.
Yeah, and I know we're going to get into tools and tech stack in a minute too, but I think it's important to realize how your CMS works, and two, your tech stack or any plugins you have operating on top of your CMS for that. Like I'm thinking we use Yoast all the time for SEO. So that lives on top of WordPress. So you need to know how you're going to extract all the information out of Yoast and then round trip it and then put it back into another language. I know we bring this up almost every time we chat, but we never want to have someone who doesn't speak the language copying and pasting stuff into a CMS or a plugin or any of that stuff. That's just a recipe for disaster. So just making sure your workflow accounts for that and making sure you can round trip everything.
Yeah, it's a great point, Patrick. And not all CMS are created equally, and we'll definitely cover that in the tech stack. And we'll come back to Yoast a little bit because that's a good one. Let's talk a little bit about social media strategies for the different markets. Um, Along with social media, I think all too often people don't give thought to, hey, we're releasing this website in all these languages. We're done, right? And the answer is absolutely not. How are you going to handle requests? How are you going to handle the form fills? And more importantly, do you have a social media strategy? Because of course, if you want people to actually visit your website in the countries, having a sound social media strategy might make sense. Any thoughts, Patrick? What are you thinking here?
Yeah, I know you hit on one. Is just kind of engagement with those folks who aren't speaking English. If you are an English speaking marketing department, just how you're going to deal with that. But also just realizing that different countries have different social media platforms. Certain platforms that are popular in the US might be banned in other countries and vice versa. So really knowing what you're getting yourself into before you do pick those platforms, and realizing that your platforms might not be the same based on what country you're going into. Um, and then, I mean, you can translate social media posts. Again, that's going to take a lot of nuance and I would say research and insights into how that market interacts with social media. So it may be may not necessarily be, a direct translation for your social media posts, but it might be a separate kind of content calendar that lives on its own, just specific to that market.
And it'll depend, completely on your product or service that you're offering too. If it sounds like if your product or service here in the States really requires a strong social media presence, I think you can probably make a pretty sound assumption that that's the case in the target market as well. And there are some tools out there. Again, I know we're going to talk about tech stack in a minute, but HubSpot and uh, some of the other CRMs that also have website integration do have some tools for um, managing your social calendar. Um, but I do think you'll want to coordinate a strategy between either your translation agency, your marketing firm, or even your in-country people. Um, because more than likely it's probably best managed by in-country, but you have to hold them accountable. It's super, super easy, I think, as we all know, especially those that run our own businesses, that it's pretty easy to kind of rest on your laurels with social media strategy. It's persistence and discipline that win the day. Um,
Yeah, I know another big tool. I'm not sure of their language capabilities necessarily, but I know a big one that our company uses is Sprout Social to manage a lot of just
yes,
everything for social platforms. So I know that's the one we like to recommend.
a lot of good integrations, and yeah, you'll still probably require the assistance of a translator. Some of these tools will have Google integrations, but we all know that the fastest route is unchecked Google translation into your social media posts. Is a great way to alienate your
Become a meme.
yeah, you likely will become a meme. That's absolutely correct. um how about this next one? It's about staff, Patrick, and building a global marketing team. um I think this is kind of the age old question. I know we see it with a lot of our multinational organizations, is like, well, where is marketing run from? Is it in country? Is it, do we have some of the product managers or people that are located, office managers that are located overseas, doing some work, or how do we do it? Any thoughts on local versus HQ running? You've probably even worked with some organizations that have had some of both, I would imagine.
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of build versus buy, I think, is the question I see here of do you invest in your own resources or do you kind of farm it out to an agency? I think both have their pros and cons. But I think if you do execute your strategy correctly, it shows how much you care. I mean, just think of how big marketing budgets are for one market, and now you're trying to say, okay, this other one is equally as important. Like you probably need equal, if not more, money to get in there because you're not necessarily established in that new target market yet. So I think it makes sense when you say it, but everyone doesn't necessarily think that one all the way through when you're like, hey, let's get into a new market. It's like it might not be a 1-to-1 spend. It's probably honestly a 3-to-1 spend if I had to guess to get in and get that foothold. And then you can kind of go back into coasting mode once you do establish that foothold. But breaking in is so much more difficult than kind of once you're already established and kind of on autopilot, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, I think it all comes down to like just sound business practices, right? And understanding what your end goal is in terms of revenue and what it's going to take to get there. A lot of our clients have distributor relationships, or they do have in-country people, but they're maybe production people, or they're, it's not the
They
right
have day
people.
jobs.
Yeah, exactly. I can't tell you how many of our sort of SMEs or subject matter experts that are in country actually have day jobs. They're sales directors or production folks or HR folks. So I think really the key is to look at what your business goals are, understand what budget you can place there. And there are paths for HQ to run global marketing campaigns with some assistance of translation and some in country people, and you know uh, kind of doing the minimum amount. I'm a huge advocate with clients of dipping your toe into the water. I mean, and then seeing what sort of success you get. Are you hitting base hits, and then can you invest more? Because I think all too often clients will be like, everything we do in the States, I want to do overseas. Well, that's awesome. from those of us that run agencies, whether it's PR and marketing or translation, saying, great, spend your money. But I think from a practical aspect, I think it does make sense to sort of dip your toe in the water and see what gets you some success.
Yeah, that just kind of brought up a good point for me, and it's a phrase that gets thrown around a lot at my company. It's we well, yes, we would love to take all the money from all the clients that want to pay and work with us all the time. We also have a responsibility, and we say we're stewards of your budget, so we want to make sure you're using your budget effectively, not that you're just using your budget.
I would agree. That's super important. Um, Next topic: testing and measuring campaign effectiveness across markets. I think this dovetails, really well. Again, you need to have some business goals, right? So, what does success look like? All right, I translated a website. Now what? Do I want conversions? It sounds a lot like the discussion that you might have when you're creating an English website, right? Like, what are the goals for the site? Well, what are the goals? What are the goals for the translated version? Do we want conversions? What are the KPIs we're going to use to measure success? Is it site traffic? Is it downloads of some case study? What is it exactly? And just like we do A/B testing on the English side of a website, you can do very similar things on the translated version. That's really not a problem. And the same with brochures and trade shows. If you go to a trade show and you've got sales reps that are bilingual or can handle, because you think it's a big international trade show, well, gather some information, figure out, what badge scans are you getting and what countries are they from. Make sure you have the identifiers in your badge capture system to know, hey, we've got 100 English speaking clients that we scanned and 40 Spanish speaking clients. You have to measure, otherwise there's no way to evaluate if your investment's successful. I think that's the key there.
Yeah, and I mean, I think A/B testing expands to a lot of things. It can be your paid media ads. It can be a lot of different things that you're testing out what will work. And I think building that flexibility into your campaigns to be able to have two similar but different versions of the same thing to see which one is landing is a great and inexpensive way to kind of see what works, like you said. And then I think on the KPI front, I think again, no one wants to hear it, but it's absolutely true. Is I think you need to set the bar again a little bit lower when you are starting to enter a market versus when you're already established into it. I don't think you should have the same KPIs immediately as you do in your source market as you do your target market. It's going to take time to establish those.
I would agree, Patrick. You have to be realistic, right? And if it is your first effort into a country, I mean, you really, you might have to look at different strategies. Like we talked about staff, right? Whether you're going to distributor route or whatever the case is, the same is true of how you're going to measure success. I think that makes a lot of sense, and that's a very, very broad topic, and I think definitely requires coordinated conversations between your language service provider, your marketing group, whether that's an internal team or an external team, and even getting some of your distribution channel in country involved, whether it's, who is that office that's going to handle those sales calls or the form fills or whatever the case is. So yeah, very, very, very important. Um, Technology, a topic that we obviously love to talk about on this podcast over and over again. I think we can spend a little time on this one, Patrick. Um, where do you want to start? I mean, we could start with TMSs and CMSs, and should we start with the beginning? Maybe we start with where it's all created. How about content management systems?
Yeah, I think like knowing the capabilities of your content management system. So that will be basically where your website comes from is your CMS. For those who don't know, we've had a lot of success with WordPress. I know there's a lot of other tools out there, but WordPress seems to be one of the most uh, not only user friendly, just to be able to make a site, but also the most translator friendly. I'll call it to get that site into another language. Um, but I think another thing you need to consider too, whatever tech stack you're looking at, is how does that play with translation management systems? There's got to be a way to hook into that or export files or whatever it is. So establishing that workflow between those tools and how the tools in your tech stack talk to each other is so important if you are planning to stand up a multilingual campaign.
It's so important, Patrick. And I think, a place where language service providers fall down sometimes is not having honest and candid conversations with a client. And I should put this, it's a two-piece puzzle, right? Or the client not sharing information on what their total goals are. I can tell you we're in talks with a client right now, and they're bringing us in, and it starts at client chat. They're like, all right, well, we have, so they're an interesting company, and I can't divulge too much, but let's just say that there's two sides of the equation. On one side of the equation, they are recruiting companies that will list with them. So they're working with what they would call vendors, if you will, because they have two clients. They have the vendors, and then they also have the customers. So they have to recruit vendors that are going to be in their portal, and then they have customers that are going to use the portal, that are going to use the services from those vendors. So they have two people that they're recruiting from. So it starts with chat. So it's even before you can even talk about websites. If you look at the complete life cycle of the client, it starts with chat. And it started an interesting discussion. As you know, we have a partnership with Language IO, and that is a full-fledged um, chat tool for Salesforce. And I think the client kind of read a little bit into what Salesforce is offering, and what Salesforce is offering is a very flat tool through the Einstein platform. And it's a very subtle difference, but I think a difference that's going to mean all the world to their agents. So one of the things that the Einstein tool does is it has canned responses, it has some translated responses. But here's the weird trick. The agent can choose something like, oh, I want to choose this response. Um, but the problem is there's no tool to understand what language the conversation's in. There's no language identification piece. So if Einstein suggests something automatically in auto mode, um, they don't know what it says. So what is that going to do? It's going to encourage them to copy the response that supposedly they just made, but Einstein made it, and paste that into Google, which is an open source, slows the conversation down. And then they have to figure out, well, how am I going to respond? And either it's through, so it basically adds friction to the whole process. And this is me. But if I'm talking about the use case, I don't want friction. These are my customer agents, right? And I want them to make the experience as smooth as possible. So it's these subtle things where you can't just read the bullet points. So the bullet points of a tool tell you, oh yeah, we can translate stuff. Great example is, some of the stuff that goes on with some of those WordPress tools that you and I have talked about over the years. I think is it Weglot, or I forget which one it is, and pretty much it offers just machine translation. So that's not really a rich environment where WPML, for example, can offer you all the options. You have machine translation options. You have the ability to export XLIF files, which then gives the control to your language service provider that then can say, all right, yes, we can deploy machine translation, but in a secure way and have a human reviewer. Where some of these tools say, yeah, we provide translation. You have to go the next layer down and say, all right, well, how do they provide that translation? So I think it's really, really smart to sort of walk the walk in your customer's shoes and say, all right, how do we engage with them in chat? How do we engage with them on our CMS? And these decisions all need to be made before you deploy technology. Because, of course, if you go and say, oh, well, we're going to do our website in Square or Wix, I'm sorry, in Wix, Square is the payment processor, in Wix. And then you realize, oh, gosh, well, for translation tools, there's very little. It's going to be all cut and paste. Otherwise, we have to just use Google plugin or something that's built in. So you kind of have to walk through the whole scenario. And then if you say, well, all right, how our form fill is going to be handled, oh yeah, we have a toll-free number that we provide that works across the country or works all across the globe. It's international toll-free. Great. Who's going to pick up the phone? So you really have to walk through that whole customer experience. I mean, I see large companies that spend an amazing amount of effort walking through the English life cycle of the customer, but not doing so in translation. Oh, we're just going to translate it. Well, okay, but if you're pulling in sort of what you want your guest experience, your customer experience to be, you need to see which parts you're turning on and turning off, because you might be turning off some of those parts if you can't service them in the language.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that I hadn't really connected the dots on before. It's not just necessarily the words on the page, but the whole experience of being on the website and like every button you can click, like you said, every form you can fill out, and kind of what happens there. Um, so yeah, that's a good way to think about that one too. And again, can't stress enough how important it is to have tools that play nice with others, because that will make your life a whole heck of a lot easier than people gatekeeping and trying to say like, oh no, that's not part of our tool. Um, I think when you're talking through kind of not reading just the high level bullet points, but getting a layer deeper, to me, the analogy I always like to think of is uh, translation is like transportation. There's many ways to get there, but a bike is different from an airplane, is different from a car, and they're all modes of transportation. But if you just say we do transportation, that can mean a whole lot of different things to different people.
Absolutely, Patrick. I mean, I think those that are in the creative world, like your world, create amazing user experiences on sites and create amazing revenue generating opportunities for their customers. And I think it's important. It's the duty of the language service provider to figure out how do we replicate that experience so it's just as strong of an experience, or if it's instead of it's the A plus, well, how do we make the B plus really solid, because the client doesn't have the bandwidth to do chat, or it doesn't have the bandwidth to do instant response and 100 use cases or case studies out there. I always think of Salesforce is a great example, right? When you start working with Salesforce, they have so many different use cases and they have such great content that they create. But how much of it is translated? And I think customers have to make, some of those same decisions. It's you really have to take a global view at how you're going to provide that customer experience.
I think too, it's a fine line between like we said, kind of good enough. But sometimes I would even say that making the recommendation to do nothing might be a stronger recommendation than to do 5% of whatever you're going to do, and leave it and say, no, unfortunately, our experience is only in English. But that you won't run into the negativity that you do if you kind of, for lack of a better term, half-ass it in the target language, and then it comes back to bite you.
Absolutely. That is a very, very, especially if you have that A plus plus experience in English, but then, like you say, you do the 5%, and they're like, oh, I guess we're not that important to you. It might be more important to at least get to a B plus or something, rather than, doing a D plus sort of effort. So that makes a lot of sense.
And I just brought it back to our first point of colloquialism because I said half ass in there. So good luck to whoever has to translate this
Yes,
podcast.
exactly. That one, it has to be so many different things in so many different languages. So it's good. Um, the last point we wanted to bring up, and again, one that we've, talked about, are kind of some, just to be careful to protect your brand, right? That wherever, whoever, or however you're doing the translation, we've seen plenty of examples where brands get tarnished in their effort to go abroad, and generate more revenue. So, um, you've heard the examples with there's some of those are very tired, and we're not going to go into them, but I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about protecting your brand, but thinking of all the important things that go into color selection and naming of products. And we've done plenty of projects, especially with drugs, where someone will say, hey, we're thinking of these 5 names. Can you just let us know if any of these 5 names in these 36 languages are a curse word, a bad word, close to a bad word, rhyme with a bad word? Just really, how on the nose. And on that point, not that we typically ever call out brands, but there's one out there right now that is actually just making me laugh, Patrick, and it's mainly because I'm Italian. But there's a surgical procedure out there to reduce, apparently, like the tummies, and it seems like it's all women that are on the ads, and it's called Sonobello. I'm sorry, but Sonobello is masculine. So, if you're going to look into this, couldn't you have at least made it Sonobella? Couldn't you have at least, it's all women in the ads. Couldn't you have at least chosen the feminine form rather than the masculine
That's
form?
yeah, that's a good point. I have heard of that. And it's funny enough to even that just brought up another idea of campaigns in different countries, but it is legal in the US to advertise for pharmaceuticals, but in other countries, like that is simply not a thing. So that's like even again full circle moment on just that example you thought of like that commercial is likely illegal in a host of other countries where they cannot advertise pharmaceuticals on TV. So
Yeah.
that's just another like one thing you wouldn't necessarily think of if you're like, hey, I've got product XYZ. Is it even legal to advertise it in the country you're going into?
Absolutely. There's so many. And of course, yes, all the regulatory issues. There's so much around that. And definitely before you invest a lot of money in translation of resources, would want to check that. It's not as ridiculous as that sounds. You would want to make sure, because depending on the class of
I'm sure
device,
someone's made that mistake.
someone's made that mistake, guaranteed. In this case, it's a surgical procedure, but I know it sounds, you just pick an Italian word. It sounds kind of good. So you just sort of throw it out there, but I see that ad all the time on TV, and it just sort of hits me the wrong way, just because it's all women in the ads and it's masculine. So anyway, um, any last thoughts, Patrick? We went all the way to the second episode. We did a recap on the first one, but what are your big takeaways from today's episode?
Yeah, I would just say I think it's pretty obvious that it's difficult to go into new markets. I think anyone who has tried it before knows that all too well. But I think you can kind of offset that difficulty by putting a good strategy in place and doing a lot of upfront thinking and work and strategy to see the viability of that before you actually pull the trigger on saying, okay, hey, we're ready to actually try to get into this market. I think if you skip right to the, okay, we're going to go in there without really thinking it through, it can come back to bite you.
Yeah, I love that, Patrick. That was my big takeaway too, is that whole point when we discussed about strategy and trying to align to some KPIs as kind of 2 points melded into one, is just to make sure that you've got a good strategy and walk through the whole user experience, and use the language service provider as your partner on this. And just if what comes from marketing is that, hey, we'd like to do the whole experience, and that number is too big of a number, sit down with your agency. We just recently had a client that has five properties, five websites that need to be translated, big Fortune 500 company. And we really helped with the scope. It's a lot of work that needs to be done. And one of the things is that on one of the sites, they had like thousands of recipes. So when it came to budget, we sat with procurement and said, hey, you know what? Recipes are probably not the best place for you to spend your money. Like if you're thinking about, what part of the user experience to trim, that was an easy one. And with a simple conversation and a simple change of scope, we brought that budget right back into line. So it's those honest conversations that make a lot of sense. And I have countless examples of over the years of when we've had those discussions. And when you lose, when you don't have that discussion, you simply go, "Up, oh, that's too much. We're going to move on." And then instead you move to someone who's a fraction less or something, but you still translate a bunch of stuff that you didn't need anyway. So
Not to
just have the
mention,
discussions.
not to mention all the units of measure you need to
Oh
convert in the
Lord, yes,
recipes.
huge effort. And you know what? You got to think. It's like, hey, most of those recipes probably aren't going to speak to the palates of the target countries anyway, right? I mean, it's just food is. I mean, right? If any of us have traveled abroad, you know that you're not doing like a lot of bacon mac and cheese in other countries. It's as yummy as it is for us. It's not necessarily a palate pleaser in other parts of the world,
And the US just has to be difficult and not use the metric system and ruin it for everyone else.
but absolutely. So the good news is that translation management systems are good at changing over measurements, units of measure. So it's easier these days than it was, let's say, 20 years ago. But yeah, definitely those are great takeaways. These were two really valuable episodes. Thank you so much for joining us. And until next time, this is Peter and Patrick signing off.